Welcome to the JOMA Preventative Health Podcast, hosted by the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association. We provide you with up-to-date information on health topics geared towards the Orthodox Jewish community. This podcast content is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice or as a substitute for the medical advice of a physician.
Welcome to the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, or JOMA podcast. I'm your host, Elisa Minkin. I'm a general pediatrician and proud JOMA member, and I am super excited and super honored to have Miriam Pascal Cohen here with me today. First of all, I want to give a trigger warning. We are talking about weight-related issues. These are super sensitive and can be triggering, particularly for people who have eating disorders or are struggling with their weight. I think it's a really important topic for as many people to listen to as possible, but if this is triggering for you, listener discretion is advised. Second of all, if there's a topic you want to hear, you want to be interviewed, you know someone you want to hear being interviewed, you have comments on a talk I've done, please, we want to hear from you. Reach out to us at health, HEALTH, @joma.org. Miriam Pascal Cohen is the founder of overtimecook.com, one of the world's leading destinations for kosher recipes, and the author of Something Sweet, Real Life Kosher Cooking, and More Real Life Kosher Cooking. A self-taught cook and baker, Miriam shares her passion for recipes, food, and photography on her website. She has garnered a large and loyal following of home cooks who appreciate her expertise and experience in creating simple, family-friendly recipes that fit the lifestyles of busy cooks who want to feed their families nutritious and delicious meals. Her work has been featured by numerous national magazines and other media, and I can say her soups are phenomenal. I've been on a Miriam Pascal Cohen soup jag lately with her split cream meatball soup and her roasted vegetable soup. Fantastic. Welcome, Miriam. Thank you so much for joining me today.
For having me.
I'm really excited because, as I told you before we started recording, you really shook the frum world up. I mean, this was a topic that nobody was really tackling, and it just blew up. It just blew up. And so I really want to start with just, first of all, a little bit of terminology, because, you know, in your piece in Mishpacha magazine, which is another really fantastic, I mean, that was so well written. It was, I've saved it. I have the paper version. It's online. We're going to link it to the show notes. In that article, you used the term fat, and I think a lot of people think fat is a derogatory term. And so I just want to ask you to talk a little bit about that. The polite or PC term we're supposed to be using now is person in a larger body.
Sure. So I actually had some criticism on both sides. And I think because this topic is so sensitive, everything you say kind of gets criticized on both sides, because everything you say will strike a chord with someone. So I had some people say, like, and this was printed in the Mishpacha as a response. And, you know, it was like, why'd you use the word fat over and over and over again? But I addressed it in my article. Conversely, when I say like something about larger body or whatever, I've had people from the opposite side say to me, you know, the word obese is considered a very, very derogatory word, but in the I'm not sure what all the terms are confusing to me, and I'm not sure what camps, you know, but in that body positivity movement, I was told that fat is actually considered a neutral word, and that is what I wrote. Independent of that, I wrote in my article, I'm using the word fat as a neutral description. I don't think, you know, if you're listening, you wouldn't see, but I think anyone who sees me in real life, if you're watching the video, I'm fat, and that's okay. Some people are thin, some people are fat, some people are tall, some people are short. And I think the idea that fat has become derogatory and thin has become praise, or skinny have become praised, is evidence of the problem.
Right.
We really need to reclaim those as neutral descriptions, because it's just an adjective to describe me. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just a neutral thing. And so when I use the word fat, I'm not using it to demean myself. And sometimes, and again, this is evidence of the problem, where someone says, what do you mean you're not fat? You look so thin today. And I say, I mean, maybe I'm wearing something more slenderizing than another day. Maybe I lost a couple pounds, and we're not here to talk about weight loss, but I'm not thin. And don't tell me I look thin, because then you're telling me that's the goal. Whether or not that is the goal, that's not the point. But you're saying thin is good, fat is bad, and that's wrong. That should be changed, because some people are thin and some people are fat. And that's just the nature of the way things are, that some people are just built bigger and are going to be bigger regardless of what they eat, regardless of what they do. So yeah, I consider fat to be at least it should be a neutral term. And I think as we talk, we'll use the word fat in a neutral, non-derogatory, just neutral description. That
right. And I might use larger body just because that also, I think that also works. It's interesting. I didn't realize it as a physician. The physician standpoint is obesity is simply defined as body mass index above the 95th percentile, and overweight is defined as 85th to 95th. And in the body positivity, health at every size movement, they will often remove a letter from it. You know, sometimes they'll talk about, like in the anti-vaccine world, they'll spell vaccine differently. They spell
Right.
obesity and overweight without the letter to show the disdain they have for those terms. And I think when you say two camps, there really are
Right.
two camps here.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I want to start with a disclaimer before we talk further, that I'm not a medical professional. I know usually you have professionals of various kinds on this show. By profession, I am a recipe developer, cookbook author. I have no professional qualifications in this area. Should we talk a little bit about the discussion I started on Instagram?
Yes, and first of all, I don't just have medical professionals on this. I value lived experience tremendously. I mean, where I'm coming from is not just as a physician, but as a person with lived experience with a daughter with disabilities. And that made me who I am.
Right. Absolutely. So just to briefly recap the Instagram conversation that I started, for anyone who missed it, or if you heard about it but didn't, get the details, we'll go back. It actually was, I believe it was December 31st before midnight, but maybe it was January 1st. I can't remember. It was a Saturday night, and I was driving home from, well, my husband was driving. I don't Instagram and drive, but my husband was driving us home from Muncie to Lakewood, and it was a long ride. And I figured, okay, I'm going to start an Instagram conversation, which I often do on Muncie Shabbos. That's a good time for it, because people are often sitting at home and a little bit bored, or especially if it's a holiday weekend like it was. So I decided to talk about this, which was something I've been debating whether or not to talk about for a very long time. I definitely don't want to talk about being fat or about body comments or body shaming. It's a very personal topic for me, and it's very painful for me. And it's not like, oh, that's something I've worked through and I'm totally fine with at all. I still struggle with it tremendously. But the reality is, I had a discussion with my husband, and I said, should I do this? Should I not? We were going back and forth, the pros and the cons. And I said, Hashem gave me a platform. Sometimes I hate that I have it, because there's such responsibility that comes with it. But the reality is I have this platform, and there's not that many people. I'm not saying I'm the only one, but there's not that many people in the frum community with a sizable platform who are, not just a little bit heavier than they want to be, but someone like me who's, I'm fat, as we said. That's just my neutral term to describe it. And I have been my whole life, since I was little kid. And it's just the reality of my situation. And so I have a certain amount of experience that, I think someone who maybe just has a few pounds they want to lose, whether it's for health or for looks, that's irrelevant here. But, those people might not have the obvious experience that I have. And I think being in the position I'm in, it just was like, if I'm not going to speak about it, who will, right? So I just decided, okay, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to talk about it. I had mentioned it very, very briefly in passing one time in my story. So I reposted the story with my story very, very shortly. And then I invited other people to share theirs. And the truth is that I put my phone down for like a minute, and then I picked it up and I said, I'm deleting it. I'm going to get like 3 people sharing a story, and I'm going to feel so stupid. I made a whole fuss about this for nothing. And I really was like this close to deleting it. And then I was like, no, I'm going to let it go. I know that people have their stories, and I really think it's the right thing to do, to give people a platform to share. And so I put my phone down for just 5-10 minutes, maybe not even. And I picked it up again, and I was just swamped. And I couldn't believe that in just a couple minutes, I had so many stories already. And you might think like, okay, and then that was it. But that night, all night, I didn't sleep that night. And the next day and the day after, and really that whole week, I was just getting stories and stories, and I was like crying. There were a few points when I really had to put my phone down because it was like too much. Some of the things that people were sharing were just like so painful and hard to read. And some of them were so painful because I had lived them. Some of them I could have written myself. Some of them were things I could never have fathomed. I didn't live them, but it was just so much. And I shared about 200 stories. 200 slides. Some of them had like from 5-10 different people, and some of them were, just one. But I shared about 200 slides, which are still available on my Instagram in my highlights. They're called Let's Do Better 1, Let's Do Better, and Let's Do Better 2. And you can read through them. My Instagram is Overtime Cook, so you can still read those. But to say I shared maybe a 10th.
Wow.
Of the stories I got. And some of them were too much to share, like stories that people wouldn't believe, and even some of the stories I did share, people said, is this really true? And I think some of those stories I would have thought they were made up, but the volume of stories themselves is what told me these stories were true. Some of the stories that were so horrifying, I heard from a few different people, things like, and I really want to go back to the beginning and talk about my own story that I shared first, just to give it context. But, like a few different people said that they had a grandparent express, like, you're my least favorite of my grandchildren because you're so fat. And if I heard that from one person, it would have been hard to believe that a grandparent said that directly. But when you have like 4 or 5 different people tell you the exact same thing, that's proof of the truth, So, I mean, I had some crazy stories shared. So I'll start with what I shared. A few months back, I was traveling. And again, when I'm traveling, if there's Wi-Fi on the plane, I often do a Q&A just to pass the time because I love interacting with my followers. Sometimes we talk about food, which is the majority of what I post about, but sometimes we just talk about life and whatever, just for fun. And I'll do polls like, have you experienced this or whatever? So I did a Q&A, and someone asked me, what's the worst advice you ever received? And I wrote that I was told, you're never going to get married if you don't lose a significant amount of weight. And I said, firstly, it's not true because I'm, thank God, married to an amazing, amazing husband, Baruch Hashem. But also, it's not only that it's not true, it's that it's so damaging, and I didn't fully understand the damage that it causes until I was after this. Like, you would think, like, once I met my husband and he loves me for who I am, I would no longer have to feel that level of,
Not feeling good about yourself.
Like, I wouldn't feel that anymore, but it's not the truth, because the reality is I got married in my low 30s. So for 10 plus years, I was told you'll never get married without losing a lot of weight. And I'm just going to be very blunt here. Okay. Let's translate that. You're never going to get married if you don't lose a lot of weight. Let's translate that into plain English. You're unattractive. No man will ever find you attractive. And whether or not that's the intention of the person saying it, that is the message that you're receiving. When you say, I'm too fat to get married, you're saying, I'm too fat to be attractive. And so when you hear that message enough, you believe it. And, my hope when I was in Shidduchim was always not, oh, maybe they're wrong. It was always, maybe I'll find a guy who will love me for who I am on the inside and disregard what I look like. And that's just as damaging, because don't tell me that I have to find a guy who will disregard what I look like, because I don't know the ages of your audience, but let's be real. There's a physical part of marriage, and there's a physical attraction that's necessary. And when you tell me we're going to find a guy for you who's going to disregard what you look like, that's really, really, really a terrible message to send to a single woman. And thank God my husband loves me the way I am. And, he tells me all the time how beautiful I am. And what really made me finally start opening up and talking about this was the fact that I'm married for 2.5 years, and he tells me all the time that I'm beautiful. And the reality is that there's still a voice inside me that says, he's just saying it to make me feel good. And that voice, to be honest, is the voice of certain people who told me this often, this line of like, you'll never get married unless you lose a ton of weight. And I'm sure to them, it was just like a regular day. They said stupid thing that they don't even think about an hour later. And yet I hear their voice in my head telling me, but he doesn't really find you attractive 10 years later. And that's really what made me say, I have to speak up, because the reality is probably people who make insensitive comments are not going to change, but maybe one or two will. So I wrote that story, in very short, and I invited people to share their stories. And the stories that were shared were mind blowing. Like I couldn't get over the volume of stories, and I couldn't get over the variety. This is something that I've kind of thought I had already figured out, but listening to or more like reading, because they were all written, but reading all of these stories really taught me that it's not, I always thought this issue is owned by people who are fat, as opposed to people who are just, I'm using the word overweight, not because I don't know if it's the correct term, I just don't know how to express it better. But, some people who consider themselves overweight and maybe have 10 pounds to lose, I would look at them and be like, but they're not really fat. And, so for years and years, I would look at people who were a size 2 or 0 even, and like looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, oh, this makes me look fat. And I always like rolled my eyes, because like, firstly, why are you saying it in front of me? But secondly, why are you feeling that way? Like, you don't look fat. You can't look fat. You're thin. And I guess this also goes back to fat and thin as positive and negative versus neutral. And I learned, and I think, not to toot my own horn, but I took a certain level of maturity to say they're allowed to have body image issues. Just because they're thinner than me doesn't mean they have to love their body. And I had come to that realization, a good few years ago. Like, I have some very, very thin people in my life who I love dearly. And I learned like they can struggle with their weight just like I can. And when I say struggle with their weight, I don't even mean with diet or exercise or anything. I mean with the way they look. So I really should say body image. So I thought I kind of like had that figured out, but it definitely was eye-opening to me to see that people who are what I would see as thin, in a size 10 body, are being bullied in a way similar to me, which is really scary, because it shows you that there is kind of there's no winning. And even more so, conversely, I heard from so many people who've been skinny shamed. So really there's no win. If you're not a size 0-2, you're told you're too fat. And if you're a size 0-2, you're being told you don't eat enough. And so, I've had a lot of people approach me and say, this is the solution, that is the solution. The reality is I don't know what the solution is. I think that's for someone much smarter than me. I always say,
no, you did ask. That was one of the last posts. I'm curious about what responses you got, because you did say, now, how can we do better? What do you think?
So my question, if I remember correctly, there may have been a question specifically saying, how can we do better? But the one that I asked that was more impactful was, I said, what have you learned?
Right. That's what I meant.
So from there, I got a handful of, that we need to eat better, which was so stupid.
Missing the point here.
Yeah. But overall, I learned, there were two camps of answers. One was, we have to be so careful with our words, because these stories were people who were literally a lifetime, because I heard from people in their 70s who had been hurt as a child, and they still remember exactly who said it and exactly the words that were said and where it was said. So when I say literally a lifetime, I mean it. So we have words causing a lifetime of hurt. And then the other camp was people saying, I thought I was all alone suffering through this, and I feel validated and relieved to know that it's not just me who's dealing with this. So, I don't have all the answers, but I think the first answer really is we're not here to solve all the problems all at once. But I think regardless of the discussions, and I know that there's so much, the traditional medical perspective of being overweight / obese / fat, whatever the words you want to use is unhealthy. And then the more modern, if you want to say, current approach of it's not all about the weight. There's so many other factors. I don't have the expertise. I haven't read the research. I can't speak to those. But regardless of how you feel about all of that, I think there's still work we can all do on the way we speak to each other and to ourselves about our bodies. Because the reality is, listen, I don't know if science supports this, but I know for myself, from my life, from my eating habits, from my exercise habits, I will never be thin. And that's not an excuse I'm making. And I hesitate to say that in a public forum because I know there are people who will look at this as an excuse.
No, you're right.
But I will never be thin. Would I be thin? Could I be thinner than I am now? Yeah, I have been. Can I be bigger than I am now? Yeah, I have been. But the reality is that I'll never be thin. And I have to learn to accept that, but also other people have to learn to accept that about me and about themselves and about each other, because the mental health aspect of what we do to people when we, analyze their bodies and when we make them feel like they're never going to be good enough to be to be worthy of praise and to be worthy of approval and to be worthy of all these things is it's just so damaging. And it doesn't help. I think from all the stories, I think this is the most interesting thing because I've had, I don't like to talk about this publicly, but I will say very briefly that, I'm a food blogger and I'm fat, and I have gotten some really, really nasty, hateful comments in my DMs over the years that I've completely ignored, never addressed them, never acknowledged them. But this is why you're fat, because you eat like this. And sometimes it's laughable because it's not even food I'm eating. It's just food I'm posting about or whatever. But I always want to say to people who I've seen, not necessarily to me, but people who are just being like, oh, you say like people who are very like harshly anti-fat people. And I want to say to them, like, do you think any of us know that don't know that we're fat? Like, we all look in the mirror and know our size. I'm not delusional. I don't think I'm skinny. But do you think any fat person has ever been bullied into weight loss and been healthy as a result of it? It just doesn't work that way. So whether or not it's healthy to lose weight is irrelevant to the conversation, because the conversation has to be about body acceptance, both from ourselves and from other people, and compassion, because you just can't talk to people in a certain way. And I think we do have to talk about some of the stories for anyone who hasn't read them. Do you agree? Just to give an understanding.
I just want to say one thing that I'm surprised that you haven't said yet, what we talked about at one point, which is that a simple answer is to not talk about people's bodies like ever.
Right. And the other thing that really came across for me, specifically with people who had been skinny shamed, or more like the opposite, praised for being skinny. I heard from so many people that, they had been praised for being skinny their whole life. And firstly, many of them said, I don't do anything to be skinny. And again, this isn't me making excuses for myself or other fat people, but that is the reality that a lot of people just because they're born that way. And they said, so firstly, why are you praising me for something I didn't do? Like, praise me for doing good things, for being good natured, praise me for chesed that I do, praise me for working hard in school, but like praising me for something I didn't do makes me feel like that's all I'm praiseworthy for. But then when it gets really damaging is when they gain weight, because many people gain weight as they get older or have children or whatever it is, then they feel like there's nothing left of them that's worth praising, because all they heard their whole life is you're amazing because you're so skinny. And I think that's such a powerful lesson that, when you talk about someone's body, and I think fat people can relate to that, the only thing anyone ever praises you for is eating well or losing weight. is that all I'm worth? Right. So yeah, I mean, talking about people's bodies and praising people's bodies and criticizing people's bodies, what is it going to do?
It's really sick. It's really sick from some of your comments, and I've heard this also, is when someone is ill and they lose weight, and they say, "What are you doing? You look amazing."
Absolutely. Someone
so
told
sick.
someone, one of the stories someone submitted was that she was in a coma, and after 2 months in a coma and losing 50 pounds, someone in her family said to her, "You should have been in a coma for another month. You would have lost even more weight." Now,
I mean, like that, these are outrageous.
That was at least partially a joke.
Yeah.
But even joke about that is so outrageous. Like, you can't do that.
Right. I mean, that stands out as a crazy story, whether it's an insensitive joke or somebody being ridiculously obnoxious.
And this is definitely not a joke. Someone said their mother told them it's a shame she treated her Crohn's disease because when she's sick, she looks so skinny.
I mean, but the point that I'm making is, like, these are horror stories. These are making it to the top because they're horror stories, but it's not uncommon for someone to be judged by their weight, even if that weight came about through sickness.
Right.
I did an interview with the influencer. She does a lot about mental health. I can't believe I'm blanking out on her name right now. She's fantastic. And it's called But You Look Amazing. And she's talking about her struggle when she was really, really sick. I can't remember her name. This is terrible.
Barry?
Yes, Barry Mitzman. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Barry. Yeah, she was
amazing.
She was phenomenal. She was phenomenal, but this is what people told her when she was suffering tremendously and not able to eat. But you look amazing. Right. And that was the title of that talk.
So many people that, like, people are like, oh, like, it's a shame you have cancer, but at least you look so thin, which I think just, highlights the insanity of our culture, that someone losing weight because they have cancer is viewed as a good thing. That's not a good thing.
I mean, this is the psychotic end, okay? When you're talking about these talks, this is the psychotic end of a larger trend, because I think a lot of people can say, well, I would never say something as stupid or insensitive as that.
Right. And it's interesting because I've found personally, and it's good that we're having this talk a while later. It's been about 6 weeks, right? So it's good that we're having this talk a while later, because I've had a lot of further conversations about it and a lot of further experiences. And what's interesting is that I find myself noticing, and I've heard from a lot of people, and I actually keep thinking I want to do a follow-up about this. I find myself noticing a lot of the more subtle, less horrifying things that either I say or I'm about to say that I stop myself, or that other people say. And, I think sometimes in a world where we're always so scared to offend people, we can take it too far, not want to say anything. So I don't want to seem like I'm saying that. But I mean, just an example, I had 2 little boys, nephews of mine in my house, and one of them is very, very thin, and the other is a regular kid. And so the older one, the very thin one, he's 7, and he said, "I'm so skinny." And his little brother said, "I'm skinny too." And I don't know that they even know what the word skinny means, and I don't think their mother talks about weight, being fat or skinny in this way in her house. But obviously they're hearing, the 7-year-old is going to school and he's hearing like, "Oh, it's so good that you're so skinny." And that's awful. Like, we have to make personal change, but we also have to make societal change, that kids don't come home from school learning that being skinny is good and being fat is bad. And again, I'm not talking about whether or not weight loss is important when someone's very fat or whatever. I'm just talking about the fact that being judged for our bodies is starting by our peers when we're in like 1st or 2nd grade.
It starts so young. It's in the air. It starts so young. That's really, really true. And I like how you said, you keep saying, I don't want to say that being fat is not a problem. And I think that, again, we have these 2 camps and there's no meeting in the middle. And it's very hard as a pediatrician, I have to say. And I know you're not going to speak to the pediatric aspect, but I can. Right. So the timing
valuable voice in this discussion, because
it's the voices together, though. It's the voices together, because the AAP just came out with guidelines. I know that when I did the live with you, you said, make sure you know about it. And it was like, I told my husband, yes, I told my husband, I said, quick, I haven't read it, print it out. He said, I can't, it's 100 pages long. Okay.
Have you read it since?
No one's going to read 100 pages, number one. Okay. Number two, the actual guidelines that are given to pediatricians are 9 very dense pages, and I'm not sure how many people have actually read those.
Okay.
So it was very good timing that you talked about this, because the part that's not coming out with the AAP guidelines is the bigger picture, number one.
Right.
First of all, we talked a little bit about some people are just in larger bodies.
Right.
And if you're going to define obesity by a specific BMI and overweight by a specific BMI, it's a very arbitrary division. So not everybody who is in a larger body is unhealthy. And there are people in smaller bodies that are metabolically unhealthy.
Right.
And so there's a reason why they're doing this, because it's quick and dirty. And we live in a world where our medical system is corporate run, and you click BMI and you can prescribe a drug and send them to surgery. But what we don't have time to do is those 100 pages of recommendations.
Right.
It's not that they didn't give good advice. It's that it was completely unrealistic. And now the reason I'm so focused on this is because with the best of intentions, doctors can do more harm than good. And I want you to tell some of the stories, if you don't mind, of medical fat shaming.
I that's also definitely a discussion that I want to delve into deeper with my audience, because there's so much there. I'm going to share a personal story that was very traumatic for me. I had a doctor when I was younger. I was in my, I would say like 12 to 15 maybe. So that's, very impressionable years. And every time he saw me, he ended off the visit with his little joke. He would like give a little laugh and say, "From now on, I want to see a little less of you." I definitely still remember it to this day. I think what's interesting is that I never even thought of it as a bad thing that doctors would say this. I just thought of it as like, well, I'm sensitive and I got hurt by it. And I think hearing from so many other people who were hurt in these ways, showed me that even if the doctor's right, which again, it's so nuanced, we can't even get into that here. And I don't have any qualifications to answer that question. But even if a doctor is correct that a patient, a child patient of theirs needs to lose weight, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. And that was clearly a wrong way. And I heard from a lot of people. And I mean, some of them were really heartbreaking, because I had people telling me that doctors would really yell at them. And I think it's interesting also to realize, like, I was fat as like a toddler. I was fat. And it's like, was I making choices as a toddler to be fat? Like, I was fed the same as my size 0 sisters. Like, I'm going to have heavier and people in my family and thinner people in my family. And, it's so ridiculous to realize, like, when people, I don't have specific memories of being yelled at as a toddler. And I will say, to my parents' credit, I was not shamed the way people told me their parents shamed them. But I definitely had, doctors that were making me feel very much less than, but people were telling me that doctors were really yelling at them. And then also doctors telling them, like, you'll do better socially, which is so wrong, because the problem isn't, they may be correct. It very likely is correct that a child will do better socially if they're not fat. But the reality is that the problem, the one changing should be the way we treat the fat child and not the fat child. I heard from so many people who are put on diets from really young, like, 7, 8 years old, they were going to Weight Watchers and things like that. Someone was 11 when she was taken to Overeaters Anonymous, which it's so intense. And some of these stories, you know, and I mean, some of these stories really, I guess, I wonder if down the line there's going to be some kind of court case that will like open the door for these things, because I haven't heard direct stories that were proven like this, but there's been definitely famous stories of people whose complaints were ignored by doctors because they were overweight, and then it turned out to be like cancer or something. So, you know, I don't know. I always wonder if like some of the stories people sent really, really felt like malpractice. One person, I have to assume that it was a dentist, first of all. I have to assume that a dentist was like a family friend of their parents, because I just cannot fathom anyone going along with it just for a stranger. But someone said, I guess the mother colluded with the dentist, and the dentist made an appointment. You read that one? Yeah. And the dentist basically told the kid, we're going to wire your mouth shut so you stop eating. And he like got out tools and made it like he was really going to do it. And she started sobbing, and she promised she would stop eating, and to convince them not to wire her mouth shut. And like, I don't remember. Do you remember how old she was? Like a little kid, maybe 10.
It doesn't matter.
But firstly, I don't know how they're still licensed to practice. I mean,
right, that's abusive. That's right. Just straight out abusive.
So, but, you know, and there, it's really like hard to believe that happened, and that the dentist went along with it. But there, you know, there are other ones. And specifically, have you ever interviewed Amy from I Was Supposed to Have a Baby?
Yes.
So I actually met her at an event this week, and we were chatting about this.
She's fantastic.
Because definitely in the world of you know, pregnancy and baby related things, it's a huge thing where, you know, people are told, you know, you're too fat to have a baby, or someone, I'm trying to remember the exact details. I apologize. It was a while ago, and my memory works like I remember big pictures, not little details. So I remember the stories, but not like all the little details. But like, I think someone was like in the middle of having a miscarriage, and the doctor was like berating her for being fat, and that's why she's having a miscarriage. And like, where's the humanity? I mean,
this is horrific. And this is, you know, the moralization that we do about weight, which is ridiculous and has nothing to do with health. And it gets in the way of health, as you mentioned sometimes. But I want to move away from that a little bit, because that is so extreme. I think a lot of people say, but, you know, a doctor will listen to this and say, well, I don't do that. I'm sensitive. I talk about weight like in a sensitive way. But there are stories of kids supposedly sensitively being told you were 10 pounds overweight. And here's a kid who maybe they were just going through puberty. I mean, the overweight is often defined, like I said, purely mechanically by BMI, right? Which can be inaccurate, et cetera. And then they lost weight and had an eating disorder, or they went through yo-yo dieting and ended up 100 pounds overweight. I have heard that story over and over and over.
Absolutely. You know, again, I don't have any professional qualifications here, but I think in this discussion, if even, you know, leaving out the anti-diet body positivity movement, even if you're in the like it's unhealthy to be overweight camp, I think you have to separate like vanity weight loss from health weight loss. Again, I'm so hesitant to talk about this because I know it's upsetting to people no matter what you say. And I've definitely had a lot of pressure from both sides to talk about this. But I think we can all agree that there's a certain point that health is, you know, even forget health. I don't have the qualifications, but, you know, there's a certain point where if someone's at a certain weight, their life is impacted, right? And again, I'm so nervous to talk about this. I don't want to upset people, but
no, this is important, and we promise we would do this. I'm giving you encouragement. Go for it.
At my largest weight, I was still nowhere near these extreme weights, but at my largest weight, I felt physically uncomfortable doing certain things. And I think that's the very invalidating part of the anti-diet movement is don't tell me there's never a reason to lose weight, because I can tell you that when I was not at my largest weight or am not at my largest weight, doing certain things are just more comfortable. And so like, I hate talking about this because I feel like people get upset, but
this shouldn't be controversial. This is
Right.
common sense.
Also, my personal experience should not be
Right.
controversial because I've lived it.
Right.
And there's definitely a point at which I think anyone can look at, I mean, I read a heartbreaking story of someone who is like 550 pounds and they were trying to visit their dying father or something. And the struggle they had to get to because they couldn't fit in a car. They had to use a bus because it's bigger and they were able to fit into it. They couldn't fit. They bought first their business class seat on an airplane because they were told it was bigger, but they weren't big enough. It wasn't big enough for them. And so they got thrown off the flight because there were no consecutive seats for them to sit in. They had to rebook another flight they were told to buy 2 seats, but I think he wrote that he bought 3 just to be safe because, and you can't tell me, forget health. I'm not qualified to speak about that. You can't tell me that this guy's life is not impacted by this. So, there's always a point at which like, it's obvious, right? But conversely, you have people who are, I don't have a right to speak about this personally because I've never experienced that. Like I said, I've been very much overweight since I was a toddler, so I've never lived this. But there are people who are made to feel pressure. People who are, let's say, naturally a size 2 and gain 10 pounds and made to feel pressure like you don't look good enough in a size 4. And I think we also need to separate that because we're talking about vanity here.
Right.
And so there's so many layers and so many, what's the word I'm looking for? So
nuances.
Along the way. It's just, you have to separate some of these things out. And I heard from multiple people told me like their sisters are size 0-2. And so they're size 4-6, which is normal.
Thin.
On the inside of normal. Yeah. And they're called the fat sister. And that's so crazy because you're not basing that on health. There's no health element there. If they're unhealthy, they're unhealthy, It's not because they're overweight.
Right. That's really true. And I think that we're not really able to separate them, but also I think with the AAP guidelines, particularly for kids, I think there's going to be a pressure to be proactive and start at lower weights. And I think that, again, this is from my perspective, is that you can trigger an eating disorder. You can trigger lifelong obesity because we know that the vast majority of diets fail. They tend to lead to yo-yo dieting, which leads to worse metabolic outcomes, higher ending weights, right? And there's no easy answer. I mean, basically what we have now is weight loss surgery and weight loss medication, and we're adding it to kids. And this is what gets me frustrated. Some people are going to get mad at me for saying it. Okay, I'm not afraid to say it because we need to be able to have these open, honest conversations about that. There are even older, kids who there may not be an easy answer for. I don't want to give personal stories of any of my patients because even without names, I'm afraid it might identify them. Right. But I am seeing these situations. And when people come in all, health at every size, friendly body positivity, yada, yada, they're not speaking to those situations. There are kids with real problems, not just from the number on the scale, but it's related to their weight.
Right. And the interesting thing is, like, I don't think this is realistic. I'm both an optimist and a pessimist.
Mm-hmm.
I think in theory, in a hypothetical world where we could isolate the weight from the moralization of weight, it would actually be much easier to have that conversation. Because if it would be like, you didn't do anything wrong, you have this health problem that you're overweight. But if it would be spoken about in a neutral way, I feel like it wouldn't be as painful and problematic and cause problems in the same way. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It does. And I think every physician should ask permission to speak to an adult. And I think they should ask permission to the parent before they speak to the child or in front of the child.
And interestingly, I've had so many people talk to me about this. So firstly, I've heard from another pediatrician who said she has parents calling her the day before to say, can you yell at my child because they're overweight? And she said patients have left her because she refuses. And she's had parents who will be like, did you get my message yesterday? And she said, sorry, I don't yell at kids. And the patients have left her practice, which I guess she's fine with because she doesn't want to deal with that. But Conversely, I've had a lot of parents say to me, what do I do? I'm worried about my child's health legitimately. It's not a weight and vanity thing. And I really don't like the word vanity. I keep thinking vanity, but it's really not vanity. It's I think vanity.
Cosmetic.
Yeah, cosmetic is the better word. But they say I'm not worried about it from a cosmetic point of view, but I am concerned about my child's health. How do I speak to my doctor about it? And so obviously what you said is so important. Speak to the doctor privately, discuss it privately. Another thing I can tell you from my own childhood is when the doctor sends you out of the room to talk to your parent without you, that does not feel good. So trying to do it beforehand seems to be
right. Or call after. The only problem is, again, we're getting to the reality of pediatrics today. I'm so sorry. It's so hard. There's not enough time in the day for this. That's right. A big problem. So another way you could do it is to be weight neutral, right? You're looking at habits. You're looking at trends. If you're going to just go by the BMI, not everybody with an elevated BMI has a problem. And I will tell you that I see trajectories where the kids are on the 85th percentile or the 95th percentile, and the parents tend to be on the larger side. I'm not worried about them. I don't care what the AAP says. Right. It doesn't matter. They're perfectly healthy in a larger body. But when I see a kid spiking up like this, I don't have to focus on the number. I can focus on, hey, what's going on? What are you eating? Right. What are you drinking? Right. And that you can have that conversation with. That's a doctor's job. Right. So that's something that's doable, but it's all in the way. And I have to tell you, I got yelled at by I can say this because it's been a long time ago already. It's not identifiable. I got yelled at by one teenager who I was alone with in the room. And I mentioned the word BMI, and she said, that doesn't mean anything and you don't understand it. It's inaccurate. And then the mother called me, who wasn't there, and yelled at me for the same thing. And then I had another parent who yelled at me because I used the word overweight. So now I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. It is so hard. It is so hard, but it's sensitive. Right. That's what I was going to say. As much as it may seem extreme, I think as someone who has lived a lifetime of this and been really, really shamed and bullied and made to feel like I was just less than always, I could say that it's not without reason that people are are so sensitive to every word choice you make. And it is so difficult because, you have to, and I'm glad I don't have your job, because you have to walk this tightrope of making sure the patient is healthy, but also watching out that you don't traumatize them for life. I could tell you a personal story that it wasn't a pediatrician, but it was in the last couple of years. I went to a doctor and she said, actually, I've never told this story publicly. Although I think it says a lot more about her than about me, but she said, let's talk, we have to talk about your diet. And I was excited to tell her, like, yeah, I was working with a dietitian, eating really healthy, making really good choices. Shout out to Beth Warren. I love her. She does not know Beth. Have you ever interviewed her? No, but I know her. I know of her. Oh, okay. You should interview her. She's awesome. But she's very balanced approach. Firstly, she admits, she loves, treats as much as anyone else, and she's not opposed to them, and she doesn't do any fads or anything. It's just, eating good, healthy food that fills you up, and eating balanced meals is no trick to it. So this doctor said to me, like, we have to talk about your diet. And I was like ready to tell her, like, yeah, I'm working with a dietitian. I'm doing really well. I'm making such healthy choices. I feel really good. And she said, she gestured in my general direction. She goes, well, obviously it's terrible. Oh, yeah. And that was the point when I just totally checked out of the visit. And I just was like, didn't listen to a word she said, because I knew I'd never see her again. She said some other horrifying things that were terrible, but I think that's a huge part of the problem with this idea of moralizing weight, where you have people, and this is there's actually, maybe I'll link to it in the show notes. Have you ever done any of the implicit bias tests from Harvard? Yeah, I failed it. You did. I'm assuming you're talking about the weight one, right? Mm-hmm. I failed it. I failed it also. I have a bias against fat people, which is not surprising because my whole life I've heard how awful it is to be fat. So
It's really not surprising. So anyway, I did a poll before I mentioned this test on my Instagram. I did a poll just saying, try to be honest with yourself. Also going back, it was like after 2 or 3 days of posting these stories, I said, going back to how you would have answered 2 or 3 days ago, do you judge people, being honest, do you judge people based on your first impression of them? And when you meet someone, do you judge them based on their physical appearance? And I think about 65% of the people said yes, they do, which is good that 65% of people admitted that. But I believe the answer is so much higher. Again, I know I do that also. I'm not here to say you guys do a bad thing and I don't do it. I know that I judge people. But the reality is that is such an important part of it, because when you look at someone like me and you assume, oh, she must be eating 3 donuts as her pre-breakfast and drinking who knows what kind of milkshakes in between every meal. And like, I don't even know, what people might think. But that's so wrong, because firstly, it's not the truth. I eat well-balanced meals. I think, I have treats sometimes, just like everybody else does. I eat mostly healthy, good food, like most of us do most of the time. So when someone looks at a fat person and they make these crazy assumptions about like how awful they must eat and it goes further than that, because also how much they must lack in self-control and motivation and all of these things. And it's just so not true. And that's really such a big part of why it's such a problem, because we talk about weight, and whether you're pro-diet or anti-diet or any of these things, you have to realize that when you're making assumptions about people based on how they look, and it's just so untrue, how much that compounds the problem, right?
Sure.
And that's why I said before, like, if we could just take the stigma and the shame and the guilt and all that out of the discussion, we could actually have a real discussion about weight and health and all these other things. But we can't, because we live in the world we live in, and we don't live in a vacuum where we could isolate things. We have to deal with the reality of the world, which is that statistics show that that people who are overweight do have a harder time getting jobs. They have a harder time with all kinds of things, because people, someone might look at me and say like, oh, she's obviously lazy and a slob and unmotivated. And the reality is I'm not, I am a creative person. So my house can sometimes be a little messy, but I'm definitely not lazy, and I'm not unmotivated at all. I work very hard. I do a lot of things, and it becomes a problem. And conversely, when you have people, look at someone skinny and just like assume, they have their whole life together and they eat so well. And so I heard from people on the opposite end of the extreme saying they had doctors who like wouldn't take health concerns seriously because they were too skinny to have, these issues, which is crazy also, right?
Absolutely.
So, I think it's so important to realize that in order to have these kind of healthy conversations about habits and food and exercise and all these things, you first have to destigmatize everything and just say like, we don't need to moralize it, as you said. It's just the reality that people are different, and not everybody is going to be skinny. Not everybody is going to be fat. Not everybody is going to, be fat because they eat nothing but cookies and ice cream and chocolate. I also like to joke that, like, it's not really a joke, but like some of these shows, like, my 600-pound life or whatever, showing people sitting down to like an entire table packed with food. And that I think really does such a disservice to people like me, regular ordinary meals. Because people probably look at those shows and say like, oh, that must be how fat people eat. But it's not the reality,
Right.
So, destigmatizing all this and trying to just treat people for who they are and not for the way their body looks is just such an important thing that we need to work on. And that's really
it's really true. I'm going to see if I can find something good for physicians on obesity stigma. I mean, I've read stories of patients getting their blood pressure taken 5 times in a row because it was normal.
So I have something funny. So I don't know if you could tell, I'm like in the video here that my arms are like disproportionately thinner. I mean, you also can't really see me, but I
Right.
have like very thin arms. And so every time I go to a doctor's office, they always like pull out like the extra large
Extra
cuff
cuff.
because I'm big. And I'm like, no, you don't need that. I have thin arms.
It's by the circumference of the arm. That's what it is. End of story.
No, but they don't notice my
Right.
arm.
They're not doing the
That
right
person, and
measurement.
they're like, oh, they don't even look at my arm. Like my arms are actually really skinny. Like all my dresses and whatever, the arms are always like gaping on me because my arms are, for whatever reason, a genetic thing. I also have like thin wrists, and if you can tell
Right.
in the video.
Right. But to take a blood pressure, you just need the right size cuff, which just matters on the circumference. That's it,
Right.
and they're using the right cuff on people and getting their normal blood pressures and saying, let me
And they
take it
don't believe
again.
Right. That's ridiculous.
Right. And I can tell you as a pediatrician, I have plenty of my patients that are metabolically, blood pressure, everything's perfectly fine. And others, we may not even be looking at them, but they may be more at risk.
Right.
We're going by statistics, but human beings are not statistics.
Right. Absolutely.
And if we focused on health, that would be the way to go.
Right. Right.
But we have to get past that stigma, which is unfortunately prevalent among healthcare professionals too.
Right. And I mean, there's definitely like, it would be very interesting actually for you to have all your doctor friends take the implicit bias test and see how many of them have a bias against fat people. But
it's higher in the medical field, because look at it, look what we're doing. We're calling it a disease.
Right.
We're looking at a person, and the minute we look at them, we're saying you must be diseased. And there is a higher rate. We don't have to deny. We're not denying reality here.
Right.
But look at the person in front of you and figure out what's going on with them.
Absolutely.
It shouldn't be so hard.
Right. And also, it's interesting. There are definitely okay ways to talk about health and weight, at least as an adult. Like I definitely have a doctor who talks about weight in a very neutral way. And I've never felt like shamed or made to feel like I was a bad person or I was unmotivated or lazy or whatever. He just talks about it in a very neutral way. So there's definitely that exists, that option to talk about health in a neutral way. I think the problem is that it's hard to find that,
There should be more training,
Right.
This should be
I've heard
part of
from
the
a lot
training.
of medical professionals over the last 6 weeks since I've started this conversation, and that's definitely one of the things that came up is not only doctors but various medical professionals saying it's really hard because we're going against a huge amount of schooling and a lifetime of professional experience, and not professional experience in this, but I mean like professional trainings, and like it's a lifetime of being taught that this is the problem, so that when you learn like it's not as simple as you've been taught, it's hard to unlearn that. And I'm sure you experienced that because didn't you start out doing this podcast without all of these I don't know.
That's correct. You're going back all the way to my beginning on how to lose weight.
No, you've told me like this is how you learned about it.
Right.
And one of the reasons that it's been so important to me to bring out the humanity of the stories is because I think one of the ways that we could really bring about change is to really think about the humanity. And that's what I really, hopefully everybody will read the Mishpacha article and I really talk about it there. But you have to just think about the humanity and about the person that you're hurting with your words. And it's just, as a doctor, you have an extra level of responsibility there, an extra level of nuance that you have to work through. But you have to take the person on their own and say, like, what am I doing to this person? How am I going to hurt them? How am I going to cause them a lifetime of pain? And you can't take that out of the picture, even, a lot of these stories came from, the awful stories were people who loved the person that they were talking to, and people who really, really thought they were doing the right thing. And the problem is that you have to think about what the long-term effects are. And so you might think the only long-term effect of telling your kid you have to lose weight is that they'll lose weight. Whether or not that's true, is that the only effect? It's not.
Right. Well, not only that, but it often boomerangs more often than not. And I'm going to give a plug for a podcast that is going to come out after yours called OMG, You Think I'm Fat, which is the title of a book by a nutritionist, Madeline Berg, who specifically does not work with kids. She's a weight loss nutritionist, but not for children, not for young teens. She said they have to be able to get in the car and drive there on their own. And that particular title came from a kid who was given a message gift. She called it a message gift. She's going away to college, and the parent gave her an exercise bike to take with her to school. And her response was, OMG, you think I'm fat? And this book is all about what to say, but mostly what not to say, because most of the time there's nothing good to say here.
Right. And I think that's the hardest thing. I think when you read all the stories that I shared and you read the article that I wrote and you read all of this, and you listen to all of this, and I think you learn a lot of what not to do. But the question is, what do you do? I guess that's where it gets a little tricky. And
it's super tricky. Listen to that podcast, everybody.
I'm looking forward to it.
That's going to come out, I think, a month after yours. I had so much more I wanted to talk. We could be talking all day, but I told you an hour, and we're already over the hour.
If you're okay with it, I can go
a little bit longer. I mean, we can't talk about shidduchim and mikvah and stuff like that. That's just like beyond the scope of, I think, where we're going to get to today. But I do want to end on a positive note, because you're right. I mean, we can talk about all the things that have been hurtful, and like the parent was like, but I just want to help my kid, and the doctor's just like, but I have to say something. And so I made a bunch of points, actually.
Okay.
Sorry,
too much.
Yeah, it's okay. So first of all, you already mentioned that we are all biased against obesity. So that was point number one that you made really, really well on your own.
I hope you put that link for the bias test in the show.
I'm going to do that. I'm also going to look for an obesity stigma, something for doctors, just a little bit more than what we're doing. I mean, hopefully this will bring about a lot of awareness. Right. And for us as human beings, socially, realize that we should be focused internal, not external.
And praising people for things that they did and their accomplishments instead of their bodies. You might think, well, if you don't want to criticize people for their bodies, you should praise them for the good things. But like, don't praise people for their bodies either. Praise them for what they did, what they accomplished, what they worked hard on, not like the body they were born into, because, bodies change. They did nothing for it. Praise them for the right reasons.
That's really important. You're bringing out a point that, a lot of times people just say, just lose weight. And this is not something that people really have control over.
Right. In many cases.
Right? Yeah.
I think some people want to say like, oh, you're trying to shift blame. I'm not saying that what I eat has nothing to do with my weight, or that I make 100% perfect choices every single day of my life. But, I think I make pretty much the same choices that most people I know make. And they're not fat.
Right. But in terms of the medical aspect, that's between you and your doctor.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. I mean, it's the moralizing that comes in here. It's the fat is bad and thin is good stuff that's coming in here. Right. And that goes back to the obesity bias that we all seem to have. I also wrote, leave diet culture behind, focus on health promoting behavior. Any physician can do that. I don't know how it helps to focus on numbers. You can use that number as a doctor to say, maybe there's more going on here. And you should look at the trends, by the way, not just a single number and a single BMI. And when you see the trend changing, and I do this for children who are not gaining, children who are, in smaller bodies, that's a whole thing also in pediatrics. A lot of times doctors are like, oh, your child is, failing to thrive. They're not gaining enough weight. And a lot of times they're just thinner, healthy children, but sometimes there's a problem. So look at the trend, but you don't have to focus on the numbers. You focus on the habits. I'll find out a lot of these kids who are underweight are, drinking milk and not eating food or whatever, or kids who are gaining too rapidly are drinking juices and soda. So if you focus on the behaviors.
Right. And the first time we spoke, you phrased it very well that, because I was nervous to ask you about if you were like anti-diet, and you said that you're not anti-diet, you're anti-diet culture. And I think that's such a perfect way to describe it. Like,
right.
You can be anti-diet culture without being like, oh, don't ever think about weight loss or whatever. Diet culture is what's telling girls who are size 4 that they're not skinny enough. And diet culture is what's telling people that you should go on some crazy fad diet and eat garbage that will make you lose weight, instead of eating healthy food. And we really need to separate diet from diet culture, because diet is just a way of eating, kosher is diet, right?
Right.
Anyone who keeps kosher is on a diet. So being anti-diet is a whole different thing. Being anti-diet culture, I think we could all agree is the right way to be.
Right, but I think that when people say anti-diet, they really mean anti-diet culture, because when you talk about diet as a style of eating,
right,
diets that are not sustainable and lead to yo-yo dieting, and then there's diets that are sustainable, but unfortunately will not be as quick. And I'm going to put a plug out there for medication and surgery for people who need it. Like, we have to stop being judgy about this.
Right. That's really true.
Yeah. Don't give health advice unless somebody asks you for it. Can you imagine?
And also don't give health advice if you're not qualified.
Right. That's true. But even for doctors, I hear stories about people going to the doctor and they're going to a specialist and it's not about their weight. And the doctor starts, going on and on about their weight. I came to you for my GYN appointment. Why are you talking about my weight?
So I have a good friend who works in dermatology. And she said that she has, I was with her and she saw someone who had like a mole that she was like, that looks bad. And it was a total stranger. We were actually in Disney. And she was like, what should I do? Should I ruin their Disney trip? And tell them, like, I'm a dermatologist. I think you should get your mole checked. So there are times when maybe it's a little bit more iffy, but for the general person, definitely there's really no reason to be commenting on someone's weight, even someone's food choices,
Right.
Like you could see someone in a restaurant eating something very indulgent, for lack of a better word, and think like, oh, they eat so awful, maybe that's why they're fat. When in reality, maybe they're just, this is their birthday celebration and they eat,
And who are you to say?
Yeah, but obviously you shouldn't say either way, but I'm saying, like, when you look at things, you just don't know the story. So like, why would you speak about, I don't know, any of
Because it's not your business, but we're so judgy.
No. Yeah, everybody's judgy.
I also wrote down, I wish we could change our obesogenic culture, because, we're living in a sea of just insanity, right? And it's harder for some people than other people.
Right.
Somebody was telling me, oh, they're really good at home and now they're going out a lot. And it's really hard because they're just a glut of unhealthy food.
Right.
Can you imagine if we stopped thinking about this as an individual responsibility and thought about it as a communal responsibility?
Interesting. What would that look like?
That would look like, okay, so for example, I'm going to give a plug for a Joma doctor I know, Jacqueline Sigelnik's mother, Michelle Sigelnik. She has a catering company called Just What the Kosher Ordered.
Yeah, I follow her on Instagram.
She's amazing. And I went to a bar mitzvah that she catered. And it was huge amounts of fantastic vegetables. It was easier to be healthier there.
Right. But I guess that goes back to the question of like, is it okay if you're having a bar mitzvah celebration? I mean, I guess, for everybody but the family, it's just another night. But is it so bad to have more exciting food sometimes?
So I think it's a balance, I think we just go over the top, especially, just with whatever carby type foods, and there may not be so much vegetables, or they may not be as appealing. I mean, Michelle had this like just super gorgeous, produce out there, and we're just drawn to it. You can have other things. She had other things. I just didn't see them as well because the produce was calling my name. And how often is it the other way around? The molten lava is calling your name.
Right.
So I thought that was really, really good. I mean, I just have so many other things I could add to that. I don't want to just go in that direction, but that there is a communal, way of going through this where we can make it easier for everybody to be healthy and think about it as health promoting behaviors rather than think about it as the weight. And by the way, you can be something called thin on the outside, fat on the inside. I don't know if you've heard of that, TOFI.
I haven't heard that expression, but I've definitely met people and know people who have said that they have that kind of issue where they have, very high cholesterol and they have pressure problems, but they're very thin.
Right. But their organs are putting on fat. That's what the fat on the inside is. And that's very dangerous. Visceral fat is. And so you again, we're doing this the wrong way by just focusing on BMI, but that's a whole separate podcast. And that's really it for my more positive, what you can do, because there's a lot we can do.
Right.
And we can bring up healthy eaters. And I'm going to put a plug for my Hunger Games podcast with Yafi Lavova. And we did so many podcasts related to this because I am completely fixated on this as a pediatrician. I spend so much of my time talking about diet with my families from the earliest, and we can make a difference. I did bottle feeding. I did an OT that does feeding issues. We did body image webinars. Just go on JOMA on the podcast and also the YouTube for some of the talks that aren't up there to see a million things related to this that we couldn't possibly get into.
Yeah,
thank you.
Also, I don't have so much experience in a lot of these things.
You're really underestimating the power of your story.
A voice.
You have a very powerful voice, and you were the Nachshon Ben Abinadav, or Esther, Queen Esther, who went out there because people really weren't talking about it.
Yeah, and
it
definitely needs to be talked about. It needs to be talked about more, because there's still people whose takeaway is we need to change our eating habits. And I'm not saying we don't. It's not about that. But the takeaway really has to be we need to change our speaking habits, and we need to change our judgment habits. And that really has to be the biggest takeaway of you should not be the one causing this pain. Will the pain still be there? Will someone else be telling the person the awful things? Maybe, but you should not be the one making people suffer and making those judgments and making people feel less than. And that's
absolutely
that every single person, regardless of what their size is or what their profession is, every single person can take away from this whole conversation is just stop making comments that people will feel bad about, which, by the way, any body comments, there's almost no kind of body comments that are safe, which is fine. We shouldn't talk about each other's bodies. That's just not the way it should be.
Right. And again, for the physicians, it's going to be a different kind of message, because we have to talk about your health, but if we frame it as health and not numbers, then it shouldn't be stigmatizing. It really shouldn't be.
Right. Absolutely.
I have to thank you so much for doing this with me. This is amazing. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing it.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. Be well and good Shabbos.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the JOMA Preventative Health Podcast. If you've enjoyed this, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and share this with your friends. For more information, check out our Instagram at JOMA_org. Check out our website, www.joma.org, that's JOWMA.org, or email us at health@joma.org.